Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Sarrouf. My guest today is Chad Pecknold, who is the professor of systematic theology at the Catholic University of America. The Catholic Herald has named Dr. Pecknold as one of the most influential Catholic thought leaders in the United States today. He's the former chairman of the Academy of Catholic Theology, and he's a board director for Americans United for Life, and is a fellow of the Institute for Human Ecology. And today we're talking about the concept of ordo amoris and how it relates to Catholic theology and how it's applied today in contemporary policy debates and discussions, particularly surrounding immigration. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Dr. Pecknold, it's good to have you back on Conservative Conversations. I think back then I wasn't even on the podcast yet, so a lot has changed, but good to have you with us.
Great to be with you.
And we're talking today about this concept, the ordo amoris, which everyone has an opinion about, after Vice President Vance brought it up on Twitter or in an interview, and everyone's talking about it. So we want to hopefully clarify what it means, what it entails. There's been a lot of debate and contestation about what it is. So we can just start with, what is it? What does it mean?
It's so funny that there has been debate because it's sort of stock teaching in theology. If you study your Augustine or your Aquinas, at some point in your studies, you will learn about the order of charity. And it's not a controversial issue. There's widespread agreement about it. Vice President Vance said that it has classical roots as well as Christian roots. And it's worth saying something about that because it's not really entered the conversation much. But this notion of the order of charity is actually something that Aristotle writes about in ancient Macedonia, in Athens. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he speaks about the duties and our obligations to other people. And we're moderns, and so we tend to think rights come first, and we don't even think about duties and obligations. But the ancient world flips that. The first thing is to think about duties and obligations, and after that, you might think about what rights go with those things. And so Aristotle naturally thinks about, what do you owe people? Like, we have debts. Like, I have, what's my greatest debt? And he's certain that we have a debt. The highest debt we owe is to our parents, Aristotle thinks, right? I mean, they made you. You wouldn't be here without your parents, and so you have the highest kind of debt to them. And after that, you have a debt to members of your family. And then you have a debt to friends. And Aristotle has a whole hierarchy of friendships. Right, the friendships that are the highest friendships are the friendships that are based on religion and virtue. Those are like high level friendships, and those kind of friendships you treat as another self. And so they have a high level of obligation. You owe them more. And sometimes you could even owe them more than your own family member if your family member doesn't share the same virtues and faith as your friend does. So that expands all the way out to civic friendships. You actually don't have obligations beyond that. Aristotle doesn't think that you have obligations to the stranger or to the poor. And so there's already a kind of order of charity that's classical. Now, Aristotle doesn't call it an order of charity, but we might call it a principle of subsidiarity, right? We might say, okay, this is like the things that are nearest to you, you are closest to. Your obligations to people are not sort of abstract. They're actually lived. They're concrete. And here are your most concrete levels of obligations, who you have to do the dishes for. And then here's another layer of obligations for the political community, to fellow citizens who you have common cause with. And then after that, you don't have obligations. The Christian tradition, basically, it doesn't negate that. The Christian tradition isn't interested in sort of saying, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Nothing. No. The Christian tradition says, okay, actually, that's there's some truth to that. There's some truth to this sort of hierarchy of subsidiarity. And so Augustine speaks in a much greater hierarchical way about how God is the cause of the whole of reality, and God is the highest good, and it's all His good that's being communicated to the whole of creation, and it's His good that's being communicated to your soul. And so Augustine's revision of Aristotle, you might say, is to say God's first. Actually, God's the one whom you have the greatest obligation to, because you wouldn't even exist apart from God. After God comes yourself, for Augustine, but not in a selfish way. The spiritual goods of yourself come second. That is, what is the end? Why did God make you? God made you so that you could enjoy Him forever. God made you for eternal happiness. God made you for union with Himself, but in order to unite you to Himself, He needs to purify you and illumine you so that you can be fit for heavenly happiness, right? Those are the two most important things, is God being first, and then your good being second. And then the third good is your family. And this is likened to God. Your obligation to God, or rather your obligations to your family, are like your obligations to God. Because just as God made you, your parents made you. So here the filial obligations of a child to their parents are likened to the obligation of our soul to God. So we have God is nearest to us, and then ourselves and our relationship to our parents, our filial obligations. Then, like Aristotle, after that comes extended family. Christians could say godparents belong in that too. There's an adopted way in which we can be family. And then after that, same thing, a scale of friendships, with the highest kind of friendship being those friendships in which you share virtue and you share true religion, right? Now it's not just religion, but true religion is modifying Aristotle. So now you have a set of standards for what binds you to your friends, including civic friendships. After civic friendships comes like allies of your country, friends of the family of families that is the nation. And after that come strangers who come seeking asylum. And of course, Aquinas gives an extended treatise, a whole treatise on the order of charity. And here it's interesting because he gives greater precision in a way to Augustine, because for Augustine, of course, we owe love to all creatures, really. We owe love, especially to the image of God. We owe God all of our love, and because we owe God all of our love, we owe every image of God our love. But we're embodied creatures, and so our interior love for every human being is not concretely practical. Right? In our exterior actions, we have to prioritize. I love all human beings, but if I'm forced to choose between my wife and my neighbor, who do I choose? My wife. If I'm forced to choose between my civic neighbor in whom I have a common vision of the good and a common faith, do I choose, if I'm forced to choose between him and an immigrant, who do I choose? And the order of charity actually is about making those judgments and helping you to understand what is practically in your actions. What do you owe? So you have the interior obligation, which is love for all, but we're embodied creatures. We're not Gnostics. Right? We don't have an abstract love for everybody. And in our concrete outward acts, there's a hierarchy of who do we owe? To whom are we obliged? To whom do we have a debt to pay? And that gives you the entire vision of an order of charity. Now, for both Aquinas and Augustine, the order of charity is actually also a way of understanding the order of justice, the order of goods. How do we order goods in a society? And what we owe in justice is not really going to be unitive, or rather, it's just going to be legalistic if what we owe in justice is not united in some way to charity, and the charity that we want to show to all people is going to be tied to really concrete questions of justice. Who do we owe what?
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. That all makes a lot of sense to me, but apparently it's not commonsensical maybe as it once was. And so I wonder what you would think or what you would say to someone who says something to the effect of, we are all equal. And in the Christian tradition, as you said, we are all called to love everyone equally, but not in all respects, per se. But I think maybe that's part of what gets lost. So could you sort of, you gave a couple examples, but could you help clarify the standard of, there are these various sort of concentric circles, but how does that square with loving everybody equally?
Yeah, so Augustine is very clear about this. We do have to love everybody equally, but equally in this sense that we want every human being to know the happiness that doesn't end. That's what we want, right? So it's already a spiritual focus of loving, right? We have an interior love for all people. We want everyone to know that happiness that never ends, which is in union with God. And so, and Aquinas says the same thing. The distinction is the embodied one. The non-Gnostic view is that the human soul is embodied, is soul and body, and that our embodied nature means that it's just not practical for us to concretely in embodied ways love all equally. So we love all equally interiorly, but exteriorly we love unequally. And this is common sense because, as a man, I love all women in theory, but I need to concretely love my wife. And it would be wrong for me to not love my wife in a higher way than I love any other female, right? So that when you put it in those terms, right, when you put it in real concrete terms of what you actually owe, it's just common sense that you're going to love in an unequal way, and that the inequality of that love is not unjust. It's not unjust for me to prefer my wife. In fact, it would be unjust for me to not prefer the love of my wife in concrete outward ways, right? In serving my God. So, there are complex ways in which, the subsidiarity does not just mean a certain kind of localism in which nothing can intervene. So Aquinas has this interesting, it's not in the section on order of charity, but it's in, I believe it's question 104 of the same part of the Summa, the Secunda, in which he says, well, you actually might want to give charity to Christians in some other country, right? Because they are Christians. They share a common faith with you. And so you actually might say, we are going to give charity to Christians in Uganda because they're Christian, not because they're Ugandans, not even because they're in the image of God, but precisely because they're Christians. And so there are ways in which the Christian order of charity is so driven by the motor of the love of God that you could do things that um, in a sense, identified uh, what it was that you were showing charity to and for what reason. Your bond with, an African, your bond with someone in Uganda who was a Christian, you wanted to protect them, you wanted to protect persecuted Christians, for example. You might say that your obligation to them is greater than the woke communist in your own country who wants to kill you, right? So, that's very concrete too. The Christian who's being persecuted, by Muslims in, another country, you actually have a greater debt to them, Thomas says, than to someone in your own country who means your country harm or means you.
That is very fascinating, and I think has interesting implications for taking this concept and applying it in more concrete policy, which requires a lot of prudence. But I mean, I guess
Hungarians, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Tom, but this is really relevant to the policy discussion. The Hungarians are the only country in the world that I know of that have a whole department that is dedicated to protecting persecuted Christians. It just speaks volumes because what that communicates, it's not huge amounts of money that they spend on this, but that communicates a certain mentality that we actually are bonded together by a certain set of, we're saying, shared values, a certain set of standards for what we think binds us together, how we understand ourselves bound together. Hungarians understand themselves as a Christian nation, and so they're saying there that our aid to other countries is actually going to be predicated on something that's extremely valuable to us as a people. And it goes back to the order of charity. Charity is this unitive thing. It's the thing that gives unity to the soul. It gives unity to the family. It gives unity to the nation. And this is why it must be hierarchical, right? But when you start saying, well, is there ever a way in which you might upset that? Yes, but it would always be on the questions of virtue and religion. It would be always, we're going to show charity to those outside of our country because they share something important with our country.
When we try and apply this, the sort of us being particular people and living amongst particular or we are a people or peoples, as opposed to, and this because we're sort of speaking in the context of immigration, the sort of more, I'd call it like liberal internationalism of either loose or, depending on how progressive you are, no borders, no distinction at all.
Right.
So when we sort of apply this, I'm curious, how, I mean, I think I know how this would work, but if you could clarify, if our obligation to our fellow countrymen by, inhabiting the same geographical borders and speaking probably the same language and being under the same government, would be applied when it comes to immigration, this sort of ordo amoris, but then also bringing in this maybe what we would call a wrinkle of our allegiance to fellow Christians, this sort of, we share this mystical body. And then in that sense, they're sort of brought into a higher level in the hierarchy, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah.
How do those two things interface?
It's interesting. A Thomist named Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange says that both liberalism and totalitarianism both invert the order of charity in different ways. So the totalitarianism puts the state at the beginning and the end. The state is the be-all and the end-all, and liberalism puts the individual at the beginning, at the end. It sort of corrupts the order of charity. So if you're going for a non-liberal, non-totalitarian view of the common good, what you want is to think about first what is necessary for safeguarding, protecting, and building up the common good. That's your first. I mean, to think first about that. That's the political ruler's first obligation. And any threat to that common good needs to be safeguarded against. That's always going to entail border control. Always. That is, if you don't have borders and you don't have a strong immigration policy, you actually don't have a common good that you're protecting. This is one of the major problems with an open border ideology. Is it's actually diabolical. Open borders are diabolical. They are aimed at eroding the particular embodied good that is common. And so if the ruler has care over the common good, then the ruler has an obligation, a duty to close the borders, to not have open borders, to have closed borders. Now, once you have really closed borders, really secure borders, you can make decisions about who crosses the border. Now, decisions about who gets to come into your country are always prudential. What are the needs? Is it good for the country to receive this person? We had a big debate at Christmas around H-1B visas and Indians coming in because they do something that Elon Musk and Vivek said we needed, right? And there was a massive debate about that. But fundamentally, that's a prudential decision of the ruler, not the businessman. The ruler needs to say, okay, we can have a policy in which we have selective immigration privileges for certain kinds of workers because we need workers in this field. But every single one of those prudential decisions touch the commons. They touch the way in which the commons actually have a common vision of the good and a common faith. These are the two central things that both Aristotle and Aquinas say that the common good needs. It needs a common vision of good, and it needs a common faith. Aquinas calls them the judicial precepts and the ceremonial precepts of the natural law. We just need these are laws for what it means to have a flourishing political community. If you don't have those things in common, the good will dissipate. Right? It needs to be formed. It's interesting, the Christian dimension. I had a student the other day, actually, who said, well, shouldn't we have as many people from the southern border come over as possible because they're more likely to be Christian? And my response to the student was, so how do we know that? How do we know that they're more Christian? And if they're more Christian, do they also love America? Are they Christians who love this particular common good? And the person said, well, we should just go what it says on the census. And I said, well, no, actually, the ruler actually has to take care for this and understand that these immigrants actually are bringing something which is good for the common wealth and not a danger to the commonwealth. This is what Aquinas says. He says that you should show hospitality and offer protection to those who are passing through. You should give safe passage through your country when necessary. But when you are considering a foreigner becoming a citizen, he says you better wait for 2 to 3 generations to find out if they're actually a good fit, if they actually do share a common view of the good that you have, if they actually do share the faith of your country. My students are always shocked by this. 2 or 3 generations, that's a waiting period that we would never consider in this country, right? I think that it just tells us that the classical and Christian tradition actually have an enormous sympathy with a very restrictive immigration policy that is prudential, that makes decisions that put the country first and safeguard the community. And what we've had in this country is decades and decades of rulers who have not done their duty, who have not fulfilled their obligations to the community. And what we have now is a new administration who says, we're going to change that. We're going to do things according to a classical and Christian model of how we actually build up and make this country flourish again. And other countries are thinking this way too, that we have to snap back to reality, and we can't be Gnostic. That's the other thing Gerd Lagrange says is this: both the liberal and the totalitarian are both Gnostic in different ways. They dissipate the good that is real in the name of some fantasy, whether it's a globalist fantasy or a fantasy about power. And they don't actually pay attention to the good that needs to be safeguarded, the good that needs to be built up, the good that needs to flourish, the good that needs to actually be oriented to God, because it came from God. And in this sense, every ruler is a steward of God's gifts. Every ruler is a steward of this gift that's been given to the person, this gift that's been given to the family, this gift that's been given to that family of families we call the nation. Because that's all a nation is, just a family of families. Family is the fundamental unit, and that goodness is all from God. And it's like the parable of the talents. If you don't invest the talents well, if you don't invest the gifts that have been given to you and entrusted to you as a ruler, then you're damnable. And we've had a political class that has completely sold out the good of our country, and they're damnable.
I'd be curious to hear more about how the contemporary church sort of speaks on all of this, because to hear you speak versus, things that the USCCB says or other Catholic organizations and charities and things of that sort, I'm pretty sure the USCCB is suing the Trump administration for putting a hold on, I think, the refugees, which maybe that's a different question, is the immigrant versus refugee distinction. There is a distinction, but we can get into that. But I just what's the? It seems like the church. I mean, we're both Catholics. I don't know what the audience demographics are, but presumably a large Christian. But what the Catholic Church does not seem to have, necessarily even be on the same page on this either, which I think adds to confusion politically when Christians are chiming in on things of this sort. So could you just maybe unpack a bit more the contemporary church versus, maybe I'd say that you're positing that what the tradition says versus sort of how it's being applied contemporaneously?
I think the USCCB is the lawyers have taken over and they're protecting their interests. I also think the USCCB is not the church. It is a bureaucratic body which coordinates various apostolates within the church. And so people should, first of all, make that distinction. I think both Catholic and Protestants alike, have for many years found various degrees of attempts to reach a concord with liberal global society to fit in. And one of the ways in which Christians have tried to, in a sense, accommodate themselves to a globalist liberal regime is by tying its own charitable work to NGOs and humanitarian work, and to do those things either together in some way or side by side in some way. And I think that all began with good intentions. But many churches, this is not just the Catholic Church. I think Lutheran Relief Services is in a similar position, and they all entered into partnerships with the U.S. government for services, really. What the government considered services. And so here you have the government, which is concerned with doing what's just, what's owed to people, what's necessary at the border. And the church has its order of charity and wants to give alms and wants to help the poor. And you have a kind of unhappy alliance between an order of justice and an order of charity in that, because the state and the church have a very unequal partnership in that. And it makes it so that the church ends up being, instead of doing its actual, the work of charity, it actually ends up becoming an employee of the government. And that is not the order of charity. That's a disordering of things. And I think we've had some of that, which, Catholic Relief Services, Lutheran Relief Services, they themselves are second order level organizations which are contracted to do the church's charity in name, but really be a contractor for the government, in fact. And that has introduced a lot of compromise, I think. Pope Benedict talked about this in his great encyclical Caritas in Veritate, and also in Deus Caritas Est, about the problem of turning church charity into NGO humanitarian work. It's compromising for the church. This isn't to say that the church and the state shouldn't partner together in certain things. The church and the state are both caused by God, and they should partner on certain things. But I think in particular, humanitarian work with immigrants has been compromising for the church. And one evidence of that is the very awkward way in which the church feels that it needs to sue the government for money that is for charity. Doesn't look good. And the fact that that is happening, I think, should be, at least for sober Catholics and sober bishops, it should be an opportunity to say, okay, maybe we need a different and better kind of relationship rather than no relationship. That's the other temptation, to say, well, this is a relationship that is clearly dysfunctional. If you lose this government funding, then you collapse. That can't be good, right? So I think it's in some ways, I'm sorry that the ordo amoris conversation didn't produce a better response from Catholics, who could have said, you know what, you're right, actually, we should re-examine this relationship, rather than say, how dare you call us money grubbing or whatever, right? That was the defensive posture, I think, was the wrong posture for the church to take, to in a sense, take offense at the vice president's, query about what the money is for, rather than take offense of it, say, okay, well, let's look at this. Is this really what we need to be about? Is this really what our partnership needs to be about? In the meantime, the USCCB is facing potential bankruptcy, and this is why they need to sue. And these are concerns of justice too. So it's a complex issue. I think there's been compromise on all sides. I think the church needs to take seriously the fact that the church in this nation needs to take seriously the fact that the nation has changed its priorities. And that's not going to change. So the church can play resist all it wants on this, but that's counterproductive to the gospel. And so my plea for all Christians in this country is to take that very seriously, that this government is refocusing the government on the good of the country. And that's going to mean a brand new comprehensive immigration policy, much stricter. And it's going to mean a reduction in the funds that the church has come to depend on. And so the church needs to re-examine its own priorities, how its own budget works.
I would be curious to hear about the immigrant versus sort of refugee distinction.
Yeah.
Not just in political science, but really in the context of this conversation about the ordo amoris.
Mm-hmm.
Is what do we owe the refugee, someone who's sort of in great need, someone who needs alms, who needs protection against whether it's a foreign government or a terrorist organization within a foreign state or, famine, what have you, versus just a quote unquote regular immigrant or someone who's interested in coming to America or any country, for various reasons, economic, social, political, and otherwise. Because it would just, Pope Francis wrote this pastoral letter to the other bishops, and he said that like the true ordo amoris, it will be determined or discovered by meditating on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And when we think about things like putting the country first, this sort of idea of like national identity or community, this sort of creates like, he called it like an ideological criterion that sort of covers over what the truth is, or the truth of the ordo amoris, which is, he says, meditating on the Good Samaritan. How does that sort of fit into what we've been talking about?
Or as another commentator put it, the ordo amoris requires us to dilate. I think these are sentimental appeals, and we should be careful about sentimental appeals. It's not to say we shouldn't think carefully about the Samaritan, but that's an individual's choice, not a nation's choice. So the nation isn't, the nation has a different set of obligations than an individual does. And we can get into how you interpret Good Samaritan if you want. I think there's if you want to take Catholic teaching as the standard, Catholic teaching opposes deportation. Mass deportations is a specific kind of category, and it applies mainly to, it was invented around the Second World War. Mass deportation was about, the Holocaust, right? So we were against putting lots of people on trains for Auschwitz and Dachau, right? So the compulsion or the prohibition on mass deportation was very much like a lot of our political debates. Everything goes back to the Second World War, and so the deportation prohibition is really tied up with these big, huge movements of whole people groups, right? That's not what we're doing. We're doing something which is licit, which is called repatriation. Sending people back to the countries that they came from is totally different than mass deportation. You're not putting people on trains for Dachau, right? That's what the church regards as mass deportation. The church says that states have the right to repatriate, and you're not taking anything away from people when you repatriate. You're literally returning them to their patria, the people they belong to. It'd be like if you found stray children at the playground, and you said, well, they belong to the playground now. No, you would try to take them back to their parents, help them find their parents, and it wouldn't be unjust to do that, right? And similarly with repatriation. And so repatriation is not only licit, but an obligation of justice. And so repatriation within Catholic teaching is I think, if you want to appeal to Catholic teaching, repatriation rather than deportation is the right language to use. Did you have a more specific moral query in mind? You talked about the refugee seeking asylum. The refugee, of course, you do need. This represents, by the way, the real refugee who's fleeing. They need to be fleeing, basically, a dictator to fit the category. They need to be fleeing some persecution. So if you get, and this is a very, very small percentage of immigrants, but that person, yeah, I would say that kind of fits Thomas Aquinas's category of you owe safety and protection to the one who's passing through. You don't owe them citizenship. but you need to care for them and protect them in some way, whether that's setting up some safe um, place for them to stay at Guantanamo Bay, or whether that entails putting them in. You could certainly, in regulative prudence, a ruler could say, you know, could use that rationale. They're Christians. They come from Africa. They're fleeing a dictator. They actually love our country more than some of our countrymen do. And therefore, we're going to put them into our immigration process. And prudence could make that kind of judgment. But normally, the first first kind of principle there would be that yes, you do owe the refugee seeking asylum from persecution a level of protection and safety. You don't owe them citizenship.
That makes sense. I mean, I think we've covered everything. I think I have a better understanding of this concept, and hopefully the people that listen to it, and hopefully there will be many, will also be, they'll have it clarified as well, because I think a lot of controversy, when sort of, as we've pointed out, it's so commonsensical. I guess as a parting question, I might ask, what it means to be a Christian citizen in America today, not just in terms of immigration, but in terms of the sort of moral and spiritual priorities that we ought to have towards our fellow countrymen and other people and other people groups, and our polity today. What would be your sort of parting answer with that?
Well, I mean, I think the vice president at CPAC said something that resonated very strongly with me, is that we need to the best of our ability, be the kind of people who want to do God's will. And I actually think this is as American as apple pie, actually, for Americans to, realize that we're imperfect, but we wanting, with God's grace, to do his will in our families, in our workplace, for our country. That one commitment of just, I would like to be the kind of person who is mindful of God's will. And that puts you in both a gratitude mode. I'm grateful. I'm grateful to God, and I'm going to be happier if I try to figure out what his will is and discern his will and do his will. I'm going to be happier. But also my country's going to be happier. In a way, the happy country is filled with people who are ordered to happiness, which is God. Right? And so that's the most fundamental thing. And then, of course, following that is building families. We've been on this long trajectory of eroding the natural family unit of a mother and a father and children. And I tell my students, you should be looking for your spouse and getting married in college or right after college. We have to become a culture that encourages that again, that socially approves of that, that thinks of courtship as something ordered not to the hookup but to the marriage. And I think this is a long-term project. This is not going to be done overnight, and any political solution to this is going to take a long time. But we should nevertheless have social and political solutions to this problem, because the future of the American family depends on building actual families. And so I think God and family, and this means that Christian faith matters for American renewal. Not everybody's going to be a Christian, but historically this has been a Christian country, and for Catholics too. Catholics have done very, very well in America. There's many of us on the Supreme Court and in Congress and even in the White House. So Catholics and Protestants have done very well in this country, and I think America has been at its happiest and its most successful when we are not just mere materialists seeking GDP expansion, right? I think GDP expansion was a terrible kind of goal that we had in responding to communism. We ourselves became materialists, and that era was devastating for our country. Yes, we became wealthier, but we also became poorer in very significant ways. And I think what this administration is doing is refocusing our country on an order of charity that is really going to be beneficial over the next 250 years. We're coming up on our sesquicentennial anniversary of the founding of this country. What's the next 250 years going to look like? And what can we do in our limited time on Earth, because all of us will die, in our limited time on Earth, what could we do flat out? Not what did we do last week, but what can we do over the next 250 years to make this country happy?
That's a great question and very well put. It reminds me of something Tocqueville says, where democracies, or one of the goals of democracies is or one of the things that you have to do for it to be successful is to move back the object or the order of our interests and our activities. Otherwise, our horizons become too self-enclosing. So that's a great note to end on, I think. Dr. Pecknold, thanks for joining me again. And if people want to follow more of your work, where would you recommend that they go?
Well, of course, I co-founded and edit the very influential Substack Post-Liberal Order. You can find me on X, and I've got a book coming out this summer with Emmaus Road Books called Fire on the Altar, all about the soul.
Excellent. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.